Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Mike Signer, the author of Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege. This is his third book. He is the former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia. So thanks so much for being here, Mayor Mike Signer.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's our pleasure. His book is a memoir. It's our first memoir we've had on the show. And what makes it so important is that he was the mayor of Charlottesville back in August of 2017 during the so-called Unite the Right rallies, when Charlottesville, home of the University of Virginia, of course, and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, was invaded by hundreds of white supremacists and neo-Nazis who carried torches, shouted hateful slogans. Many of us remember seeing that video. They attacked counter-protesters, and one counter-protester was even killed by a terrorist who drove his car into a crowd of people. And so the mayor's book recounts not only that day, but the lead up to it, which many of us watching from afar didn't realize was boiling for many months, and I didn't until I read through your book. But some could say it was boiling for even longer than that. So let's start this conversation with Thomas Jefferson. Of course, it would be his city that would be the one that this kind of thing would happen in with all that he represents.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I wanted to write the book, I think primarily for the reason that you just said, which is this is going to be an instance of modern American history that will be discussed for, I think, for generations. What happened in Charlottesville. It'll be a touchstone like Selma or Hurricane Katrina or the Kent State Massacre, other catastrophes that take on different layers of meaning and that need to be understood. And I was in this really unique position. And you're right, there was a prehistory to it. And it's important to understand because history that unfolds in local contexts, like city politics, you have to understand all of the twists and turns and all the surprises that got you to that point. And I think that's a very astute observation, Evan, that it was in part because of how famous Charlottesville was, because of Thomas Jefferson's association, that all this began there in the first place. And two of the most prominent white nationalists who ultimately geared up this whole event were University of Virginia graduates. So there is a story about the town's connection to Jefferson that put it on the map for all of this series of white nationalist events that happened in 2017.
Yeah. So what I want to have you do is just describe Charlottesville for those of us who haven't been here or haven't been there. I haven't been there. And also the monuments that were there at the time that this was all happening, because the stated purpose for this rally was to protect the Robert E. Lee statue. So explain Charlottesville for us, just kind of a day-to-day basis, what it's like, and then just the kind of context that it's in with all the memorials and monuments that are there.
Charlottesville is a small southern liberal college town that is also extremely famous and that has an outsized reputation that draws a lot of media attention to things that happen here. But at its root, it's a progressive town of just about 50,000 people that is 2 hours from Washington, that has the University of Virginia here, and Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home, is right nearby. It's quirky and very progressive, voted for Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. Beautiful. There's a deep sense of history. There's a lot of infill development. So there's a real lived in, creative sense of town. There's a downtown mall, which was created about 30 years ago, where the main street was blocked off and people walk on it. That's kind of the center of town. But there's also, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask, do people grow up and stay there, or do they grow up and leave?
All things happen, but there's a very famous trend that happens here where people who come here for the University of Virginia end up moving away and then coming back, where they end up staying because they love the town so much. There was an alternative news weekly called The Hook, which was based on that's a famous local saying that Charlottesville is a hook. You get hooked, you come here, you come back here. That was my story. I went here. I had two younger sisters who had gone to UVA for undergrad, and I went here for law school, and then I moved back to Northern Virginia to go practice law and do a bunch of other stuff. But I ended up wanting to come back here to have a family. So it really does hook you. But then there's a problem here, which is a history of white supremacy and of systemic racism, because it's a southern town, and there was particularly brutal Jim Crow and laws here, and the schools were shut down rather than desegregate, and Black neighborhoods were raised under urban renewal, and there's a lot of pain and trauma that lingers, and there's systemic poverty among the local African American population, especially, which is about 20% of the town. And so you have a very mixed reality where you have a very charming town that often is ranked in the top 5 of towns around the country for livability or health or foodies. But then you have this kind of brewing history underneath where there has been systematic injustice. And a lot of that comes to roost in people's feelings about the history. And you had these 2 Confederate general monuments that were put in place in the 1920s, right near what is now the downtown mall, to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And especially one of them, Robert E. Lee, is dominant on top of kind of a hill in this one park, and it became the topic of protests to take it down in 2016. And that's really the beginning of the story of the book.
And the book recounts in tremendous detail and really vivid detail just all of the things that kind of started to happen that led up to these rallies. But explain when you first realized that Charlottesville had become a target, not just as a point of discussion, but as a target for this kind of a rally.
Well, the national story that broke was when Richard Spencer, who is this white nationalist who went to UVA, who started a think tank called the National Policy Institute. I think I use the word think tank lightly, but he founded the term alt-right, and he very famously led this group of his acolytes who are frightening. They have buzz cuts. They wear this uniform of khaki pants and white button downs. And they all went to the Washington Hilton a couple weeks after Donald Trump won the election in 2016. And they did this kind of series of Heil Trump salutes and it looked like a neo-fascist gathering in the nation's capital. So Richard Spencer did that. There was this brewing controversy that got way more national exposure than it should have between this right-wing blogger in Charlottesville and the African-American vice mayor of the city, who had launched a drive to take down the Lee statue. And the right-wing blogger is named Jason Kessler, and he wanted Wes Bellamy, who was the vice mayor, out of office for a whole bunch of reasons, and really targeted him. Kessler was particularly adept at getting national coverage and networking to people like Richard Spencer, who was already a national right-wing celebrity. So in May of the next year, Spencer came and did a flash mob of about 100 of his followers at the Lee statue, capitalizing on several months of media attention to this drive that Kessler was doing to get Bellamy out of office, which failed. And Spencer and his followers had tiki torches at the Robert E. Lee statue, and it was at night. And I was the mayor of the time. We had just declared ourselves a welcoming city, where we have 100 Muslim political refugees that come to Charlottesville every year through the International Rescue Committee, and it was very important to me to say that we were welcoming. And so I may have contributed unintentionally to the growing firestorm that was, and I talk about this in the book, because I put out a blistering statement saying that such hatred, we're a welcoming city, but such hatred is not welcome here, and this is reminiscent of the Ku Klux Klan, and wanted to repudiate these people. But very quickly that it was a sensation. It was on like CNN International that there was this rally of 100 apparent neo-Nazis with tiki torches at this Robert E. Lee statue. Meanwhile, the city council had voted to remove the statue, but could not do so because there was a state law preventing that from happening. So there was this very pent up situation that was leading to tons of conflict between protesters and counter protesters, the very far left and the very far right. And that really created this witch's brew of what then became the Summer of Hate in Charlottesville.
Yeah, and we definitely want to. We are going to talk about the sort of thing that leaders battle when they decide how they're going to respond to these groups. Does the response bring them more attention, or is it something that has to be said? And I'll be darned, I won't say something about it. But I do want to get to that. But you've heard me. People listening have heard me call you mayor, but I think it's important, and this is one of the themes in the book, that mayor is not the mayor that I grew up watching in New York. Right. The mayor of New York is like the king of New York. Right. Mayor of Charlottesville is a much different title, and this is one of the things that you wrestle as you try to navigate this sort of blossoming crisis that you have. So explain what mayor of Charlottesville means and what the difference is between a weak mayor and a strong mayor.
So 50% of American cities almost have this form of government that almost nobody knows what it is until there's a crisis. It's called a weak mayor form of government, where you have a professional city manager or county executive sitting on top of the government, and they are the operational head of the government. And this was created in the progressive era, over 100 years ago, to try and professionalize government. So the mayor, even though they have that title, they are really the chair of the board. So the board is the elected officials who pass policy for the city and vote on the budget, but they are not operational. So operational means they do not have authority over the day-to-day operational decisions of the government. That's the city manager's job. Not only do they not have authority, they're prevented from having authority because it is the city manager's role. So that was the situation we had in Charlottesville. Was the city manager was the emergency manager for the city. They controlled the staff, the police reported to them, for instance, or they made decisions about how the city communicated. And the mayor, even though you look like you're supposed to be running the city, you're not running the city. You're just the chair of the board.
People may look to you because they're familiar with the term mayor. When you talk about this in the book, they go, right. Oh, well, that's the mayor. But in reality, you can't do the things that I suppose traditionally we think a mayor can do. Order the police chief to do something, order a street shut down, fire the head of the garbage department, fire sanitation, deal with the sewers. Right. You're basically just hiring the person who's going to do that as the board. And so talk about what the role is as chair of the board.
Well, you make policy and you hire the city manager and you hold public meetings. So you take in public comment. A colleague of mine referred to it as sort of a combination of the legislative and judicial branch, because you make laws. So you pass ordinances. The city council, that's the most probably important job they have other than passing the budget. But you do not, and you kind of hear citizen complaints. So it creates this really complicated situation where city council, they hear people. So they come to the city council with complaints or with their ideas in public comment sessions. But really the person in the government who can actually do something about those complaints most directly is the city manager. And I talk about this a lot in the book. And it's crucial to understand, because so much of what's happening right now in all these cities, Minneapolis or Atlanta or Washington, D.C., or you look around the country, has to do with what the powers of the local elected officials are and are not. And so the devil is always in the details. If I could say there's one takeaway message from this book in this time, it's that the devil is in the details. And in a time of like collapsing civic education, when journalists don't pay very much attention to the nitty gritty of local government, and when they don't even know, that was one of the problems that we had. It's really important to get down into these details, because that's the only way that anything is going to happen that makes people feel like we're moving forward as a country.
So this all really matters while you're mayor of Charlottesville during this sort of crisis.
Hugely.
And so explain some of the battles that the city was engaged in. You were facing demands to simply shut this rally down. there was a First Amendment debate that was going on over whether they had the right to simply show up and say these things. There were questions
Yes.
about whether you could ban things that they could bring into the area. There were questions about whether you could just simply move the rally to somewhere that you thought would be more safe. So describe some of these battles and how your position as weak mayor, not you, but the position of weak mayor, didn't allow you to solve these problems.
Well, I'll give you 3 examples of dozens in the book. One was the demand that we get rid of these Confederate statues, and that I get rid of them, which was happening. There was to add a layer of complication onto this. Virginia is what's called a Dillon's rule state, where cities have less power. It is anti-home rule. So you have some states in the country where cities can do whatever they want. Virginia is the exact opposite, and we have a part-time state legislature. So you actually will be sued if you're a city and you pass any ordinance that's not allowed by the General Assembly in Richmond. On top of that, the General Assembly in Richmond had passed a law that said cities may not disturb or remove war memorials. So there was this law sitting there. And then meanwhile, I, as mayor, in this weird space of policy where you're trying to shape policy of the city, but you can't direct actions, I got my colleagues to agree to set up a blue ribbon commission on race memorials in public spaces that met for 6 months and had 17 public hearings, and it was majority minority. And they ended up confounding a lot of people and recommending that the statues, they gave us 2 recommendations, but that they would stay inside Charlottesville. They heard a lot of testimony from African Americans in Charlottesville that the statues should be recontextualized and seen as teachable moments, which surprised a lot of people. And we ended up, and as we were trying to navigate the legal environment, and as even the city manager was trying to figure out how would he create the budget to move the statue, if that's indeed what city council would want to do, not something the mayor could do. City manager would order like public works out there. If there was a lawsuit that led to an injunction, and that was all stopped anyway. That was one kind of complication that came from the former government we have. Another one is what you just were talking about, which is First Amendment. So we had the Ku Klux Klan from North Carolina filed a permit to come to town to protest the planned removal of the Lee statue after Richard Spencer and his goons came in May. A lot of people were coming and protesting a city council meeting saying, Mayor, you got to stop this permit, stop the permit, cancel the permit. Not only is that not a power that the mayor has, like literally in the city manager form of government, the permitting office is under the vertical of the city manager. And it leads to First Amendment complications if politicians get involved in permitting decisions, because that's more likely it's more likely to signal that the city is concerned about the content of the speech if politicians in a city manager form of government are getting involved in permitting. And I really didn't want to lose in court anything that would happen with the KKK.
Right,
so we
then
had
you
to
give them a
follow all
victory.
these.
Yeah.
Then you give them a victory, and they're raising money off of it. And you see this happening around the country now in different ways. And so it was very frustrating to people to have the mayor not only kind of explain what I'm explaining to you, which is this is the permitting office of the city manager, but there was also just this complication of the of what the First Amendment dictates and how much local officials' hands are tied to get involved in any free speech event, even with hate speech, absent any specific evidence of a planned unlawful act. And one other example that I'll say to you that goes to the confounding nature of the job, I include in the book a series of text messages that I had back and forth with the city manager at that KKK event. The police clashed with left-wing counter-protesters who had come. And the police released tear gas against the left-wing counter-protesters after the Ku Klux Klan left town. And there was a whole conflagration, and it was awful. And the police kind of refused to let the counter-protesters have this street. They decided to use tear gas to clear the street. I didn't know anything about this because the mayor is not involved in policing, certainly not in day-to-day policing and not in the minute-to-minute decisions that were being involved. I had issued a statement kind of broadly standing by the police. Then it started looking like the police may have told what ended up being a false story about the counter-protesters having provoked this tear gas incident by releasing pepper gel. So then the city manager came to me and then he said, you have to take down or amend that statement saying that we have to get to the bottom of what happened. And I said, it seems like the police may have overstepped. And he said, this is leading to real heartburn. You could really undermine the force with this. So then I amended the statement again. Meanwhile, I never knew what actually happened. And it took until 6 months later in an independent investigation for us to get the facts that there was not, in fact, a provoking incident. And there had been a mistake that was made. And all this, I just wanted to tell kind of the gory details of the sausage making that happened between the city manager and mayor, because I think it's very common now that you have these intragovernmental conflicts that create a lot of the stress and the immobility that frustrates a lot of people who want local government to act really swiftly or decisively.
Yeah, and you're looking.
And even in this case. Yeah. In this case,
I'm a weak mayor.
We couldn't even speak clearly about this tear gas incident that had happened and couldn't even get an explanation from the police. And it really created a lot of the ground for the intense conflict that happened during the Unite the Right rally.
And you also took a lot of heat as mayor for your original position on the statues, which is this sort of middle ground, this pragmatic thing. And it seems like there's no more middle ground anywhere. And I'm not passing judgment on whether that is good or bad or right or wrong. But you took a lot of heat because your original position was, I don't know if just yanking this thing down is the right thing to do. And that goes in contrast to what a lot of folks on your side of the aisle and of your line of thought generally think.
Well, yes. What is so important to me in this story is it's not so much about me. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of candor in this book about the stress and strain that a crisis puts on a local official, namely in this story being me, but you see this happening all around the country right now in Minneapolis or different cities where there are crises. But it was important for me to get down on paper the actual facts that led to this decision for me, which were, as this Blue Ribbon Commission found, there were many leading African Americans who came up and said they wanted the statues to stay. And it was shocking to people. And they wanted them to be there as teachable moments. And I tell the story of this African-American neighbor of mine who said to me, I want them to stay so that my grandchildren know what happened. So I ended up supporting the recommendation of the Blue Ribbon Commission, which was that the statue stay, and making a speech about this teachable moment idea, which was that let's radically recontextualize them and I met with a landscape architect who came up with this scheme of putting these 12 very tall panes of plexiglass that would be called lenses around the park that would have inscriptions on them about slavery and about racial justice, so that you couldn't see the Robert E. Lee statue except through these lenses, which would be a testament to modern values. So we're trying to realize this idea of that the Blue Ribbon Commission had recommended about transforming the monuments in place, and that now clearly is a minority position among the left with all these Confederate statues that now people are moving to utterly remove. In general, I think the moment has changed and that all of our opinions belong in a pre-white domestic terrorist phase, like what happened in Charlottesville, because history does change. However, Jelani Cobb of the New Yorker just did a fascinating tweet about what has happened to the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, where it looks like the Berlin Wall. It's got it's festooned with
the graffiti,
Black Lives Matter and graffiti. It's got projections of Harriet Tubman on it, and it is being radically recontextualized as we speak.
And that's part of the history now too of that monument.
100%. And I talked in the book about what are examples of dramatic recontextualization. And there are many examples, but I think the movement, I think the moment has changed. I think there is a real question now about are there radical recontextualizations that could satisfy what we were being told in Charlottesville from the Black community about providing these as teachable moments while giving testament to our present values? And that's an open question in the book. But I talk how there was this example in Richmond of the Arthur Ashe statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, and also adding this extraordinary modern statue that was just put there, a 30-foot tall equestrian statue of a Black man by a contemporary artist, and on horseback, right near the one of the Confederate General Jeb Stuart. And to me, that was a very compelling example of adding more history. And I still have misgivings about a total approach that removes all of these irritants, but I do also think that the moment has changed. And to me, the major thing is just that statues, whatever happens with them, they are a beginning of our project to achieve racial justice, not an end.
Yeah.
If that's all that you're doing, it can't be the end of the story.
Yeah, it's sort of the thing that's most visible and easiest to sort of wrap your mind around. It's either there or it's not there. We talked about that statement that you'd made briefly, and you ended up regretting that statement, kind of criticizing these white nationalists. And you wondered in the book whether it might have further attracted the attention of white nationalists to Charlottesville and made the city more of a target. But I want to ask, what advice would you give to people based on what you've gone through who want to speak up, but they're afraid that the more you say, the more likely you are to experience what you experienced, which was death threats? It's just really this difficult thing to figure out as to what you should say and how you should say it. And this not just for mayors, this is people in their everyday lives or on social media. What advice would you give to people who say, I want to speak up about hate that I'm seeing, but I'm afraid of having people come after me?
Well, it's a great question. And if I'm pausing, it's because I am reflecting on it. There's a lot in the book about what communities can do in terms of policy and actions to confront extremism. There's a whole project that I started up with the Anti-Defamation League and a couple other partners like the Fetzer Institute and the Charles Koch Institute, which talks about creating strategies where before, during, and after extremist events, you employ both the hard and soft sides of policies. So we need more on the hard side: investigation, prosecution, cracking down and creating new laws and new structures. Like we sued these militia groups that invaded Charlottesville using this law that had never been used before on the hard side with Georgetown University. Soft side, you need civic groups and schools and community relations officers at the police departments to reach out to groups that are marginalized so that they're not radicalized or victimized. And you need strategies to do all this in a proactive posture. So there's a lot of learning that's happened at the community level. You're asking about my experiences personally, though, as a leader and what I would teach people. And I want to be very humble about this because leadership is highly individual and you're bringing your own experience. I talk in the book about how I brought my experience visiting Israel and seeing native Israelis who call themselves sabras, which is a prickly pear, which is prickly on the outside and sweet on the inside. As I kind of developed my own approach to the trolling and the anti-Semitic attacks that I was experiencing as a Jewish mayor, and how I wanted to stand up for and be an ally to the Muslim community in our city that was being attacked. And I did that up to a certain point. The national, the Associated Press wrote the story about Mayor trolls the trolls, and I was really jabbing back and trying to highlight and expose what this phenomenon of trying to intimidate public officials. And then I got a call from the ADL, and which put me in touch with the FBI, and we had a real conversation about when could this kind of poking and prodding that I was doing and really having a strong, adamant face for the city against hate speech and these maniacs, when could it backfire or put me in the sights of just somebody, a rogue, crazy person like you see. And at some point I decided that discretion was a better part of valor, and I would focus on what government was actually doing rather than just kind of declaiming all the time. I think that alliances are really important. I think that if that's one of the lessons that comes out of my experience, if you show that you are an ally and you back that up with actions to embattled groups, and you're in a position of power, and speeches are very important, but actions are probably more important. And statements show kind of actions of resolve, of alliance. That signals that there's a system of forces who are together against these attempts to intimidate the city. Like after the Tree of Life, the Pittsburgh Steelers put a Star of David on their logo in Pittsburgh when there was that massacre at a synagogue. Yeah. Very powerful leadership statement from a football team, for instance. And so I think that I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
So alliance is the way, as opposed to being the keyboard warrior and drawing the fire of these folks.
I think so. And I talk a lot in the book about how I came into this job of the mayorship and all of the publicity that we had, with deep misgivings about a politics exclusively of symbolic victories. And there had been a lot of symbolism and a lot of symbolic fights in Charlottesville that preceded me. And I came in wanting to be somebody who really focused on action and could demonstrate what government was doing. How were we changing the lives of people? And especially when you have a president who thrives on symbolic victories and has really distracted us from substance to symbols, I have misgivings about purely symbolic statements. But on the other hand, that's what people need: symbols. And they need to hear, they need to see symbols and statements and powerful speeches. So I guess the best answer is that you're able to do both. You're able to show people that you care about what they care about with symbols, and that you're giving powerful speeches and you're taking powerful stands, but it has to be wedded to actual meaningful action that happens when the spotlight is off the leader.
So let's talk about 8/12. That's the kind of the date that you put in the book. You made it, look almost like 9/11. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but very rarely do we see dates like that in a book. And you had 8/12 in there. So that's, certainly what the day meant to you and to Charlottesville. Thank goodness 3,000 people didn't die, but that's just sort of what the symbolism that's kind of how the symbolism hit me. So explain 8/12, explain the day, explain where you are as a weak mayor. You were kind of looking for a home to kind of a base to kind of watch this all from. So 8/12 hits, these folks are coming to town, and here you are as a weak mayor trying to figure out what to do and how to keep your people safe.
Well, and key to telling this story is what happened 2 weeks before this. So August 12th was the planned date for this Unite the Right rally, which, because of all the events I talked about earlier, these two white nationalist events and tremendous conflict between the activist community and the police about the response when the KKK came and the use of tear gas, and how the Virginia ACLU had generated this kind of statewide protest against the city of Charlottesville about how they had responded in this earlier event. And so and then meanwhile, there was a national call to the right wing and the alt-right movement to come to Charlottesville. And then there was a national call to the left-wing movement to come defend Charlottesville. And I led an effort from the weak mayor position to force a relocation of that event from downtown Charlottesville to a park where the groups could have been safely separated. And that led to just an extraordinary conflict within the government that not a lot of people knew about at that time, which is the mayor and the city councilors overruled the city manager and the police chief and the city attorney. And we stepped very kind of dramatically into the operational role, which wasn't part of our jobs, but we were so alarmed about the mishandling of the prior events that we said this can't happen in downtown Charlottesville where the Lee statue is, even though First Amendment law, absent any evidence of a planned imminent unlawful act, they want hate speakers to be physically next to the thing that they're talking about. So we knew that a judge was gonna likely rule in favor of this whole Unite the Right rally happening right next to the Lee statue, which is right in crowded downtown Charlottesville. And we thought that would be a disaster. And so the elected officials overruled all of the administrative officials in the government and hired an outside law firm to try and relocate the rally and give us a rationale to do that. And the rationale was that the rally was going to be bigger. The content neutral rationale was there were going to be more people and it couldn't be safely handled than the original permit application, which said there were only 400 people were going to be there. And we ended up getting sued and lost in court, in federal court, by the Virginia ACLU, lost on the eve of the rally. So on the day of the Unite the Right rally, I'm reeling from that court loss. There had been a violent march of these groups on the UVA campus the night before, where they were using tiki torches and they had brawled with protesting students next to the Thomas Jefferson statue while chanting "Jews will not replace us." I had been on the phone with the Attorney General's office and with the president of UVA the night before trying to figure out, was there some way we could go back into court to try and stop the rally? Our city attorney's office said that they didn't think that we could. They didn't file for an emergency injunction. The Attorney General would have had to represent the university because that's how it works in Virginia. And so there was this sense of impending doom and loss and righteous anger as this whole thing was happening. And then the day happens. The groups, it turns out that what we didn't know, and there was this whole collapse at the federal level, which is a whole other story in the book, was that this national invasion of the city was going to include organized paramilitary groups. Militias came to the city, 11 of them, who were right-wing militias with assault rifles and uniforms and insignia and command structures. I couldn't be on the site of the rally because the police chief had said that they couldn't provide anybody to accompany me or protect me. And it seemed like it wouldn't be safe for the mayor of the city to be out there without anybody. So I was in City Hall at the time monitoring everything and hearing about things, which was near. I wasn't even allowed in the command center, which is where I wanted to be. And I tell this very painful story in the book about demanding to be in the command center, and the city manager refused me entry.
Yeah, they say to the empty conference room upstairs. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that you needed all of us aligned. I mean, you had an unfolding firestorm. You needed the citizenry needed to hear from us. They didn't even hear from us until 6 o'clock that day, and it really was a mess. And the rally was disbanded, and then the car attack happened.
Right. So I was going to ask. So where are you? What's happening? As far as you can tell, when you find out that Heather Heyer is killed by this vehicle?
Well, after being refused entry to the command center by the city manager, I went to the emergency operations center, which is sort of where the secondary leaders had been sent, like the University of Virginia president and our fire chief, who should have been at the command center but wasn't. They'd set up this whole other operations center with TVs and monitors, but it wasn't where the police were, and the Virginia State Police. So I was there when I heard about the car attack. What had happened earlier in the day was...
What goes through your mind? But just let me just pause you for 1 second.
What went through my mind was I talked about it in the book, it was hard for me to process that it could have been intentional. And I put up a tweet, I think, when I learned immediately that somebody had died, even though I wasn't really in the chain of command, but I thought it was important. And I watched the video, and I only saw one take on the video first of the car plowing into the protesters. And it just seemed like I couldn't process that level of evil or intentional murder. Even though you'd seen cars weaponized elsewhere, my brain didn't want to accept it. And then I pretty soon after saw the video of the car backing up, driving back from having run into the crowd, and then backing up. And then it looked like, I mean, I thought maybe somebody elderly had a stroke or had accidentally pressed the accelerator, which who knows, or somebody had a seizure. And somebody actually put up sent me a message or something saying this was intentional. And then I think I processed like everybody else slowly and then quickly that it had to have been an intentional act. And then you were like, oh my God, this whole thing just took on a whole different, it kind of became the absolute worst thing you could have imagined. I mean, I talk in the book about how I was writing my journal a couple of days earlier and trying to think about the worst case scenarios. And a lot of what I had feared happened. You had the police have to declare an unlawful assembly because they didn't have any other tools, and everybody was disbanded, but they didn't have plans to separate the groups from each other before, during, and after the event. And that made it much worse. But this thing about having a neo-Nazi weaponize his car into a group of counter-protesters was about the worst thing that I could imagine. And I think we're still living with that, with what happened in the city today.
And then we find out that Heather Heyer is a young person who was there to protest honestly and safely, and she's in this group of people. And you met with her family, and her family had some very poignant words about the pain that they had been through. Why don't you just describe?
I met only, as I was preparing for this book to come out, Evan, I met with this was just last fall. I met with I think 4 survivors of the car attack, just to kind of meet them and understand where they were. And there are 2 people, this is over 2 years after, who still, one was kind of hit on the arm by the car, and they witnessed all this unfold right in front of them, and they still can't work. They're so traumatized and so haunted by seeing,
to this day,
seeing several dozen people mowed down, thrown in the air by an intentional use of a car. It was a very crowded group of joyous protesters who just kind of run the neo-Nazis out of town. And it was very, there's so many levels of trauma that the book records and talks about, but that was the most enduring, painful one, was the people who were right there on site and what they experienced, to me.
The biggest regret that you had, and I'm wondering if you're being a bit hard on yourself, but the biggest regret that you had was that you couldn't calm things down, that you didn't have this magical power to say something and have people go, maybe he's right. When I look at the images of that, that were recorded by all the newspapers and magazines and websites and Twitter and all that, I myself am petrified of from what I've seen. And I've seen these sorts of things in person myself, just because of what I do for a living. So I would ask, are you being hard on yourself? Is there anything that can calm these folks down? I mean, look at what they were capable of, and look at the imagery they were willing to carry around, tiki torches and in what's supposed to be a studious town, and screaming blood and soil and all these terrible things. Was there any calming these folks down? Is there any calming them down? What do we do about this kind of hate?
Well, and unfortunately, there is components across the spectrum. So you also did have a significant anarchism across the spectrum, left and right. And a lot of that was directed at the elected officials. And you're seeing that happen right now in cities around the country, Seattle and Minneapolis and Washington and Richmond right now. And people are very angry today about many things. And rightfully, some part of that anger has become anti-government and anti-institution entirely. There's no role for government to solve these problems in this view. And virtually any government official who's actually talking about solutions is the enemy, because it's not going to come through government. And that really worries me. And I told this very harrowing story of what it's like being in a position of policy making, for the reasons that I wanted people to understand what it's like. And lo and behold, I wrote this book about what it was like in Charlottesville in 2017. You have situations like this with these kinds of conflicts and this kind of havoc in cities around the country right now. And the challenge, when I look at the anger about police brutality and systemic racism, the righteous anger has to be channeled into action. It's going to have to be channeled into how is government solving these problems. If you're going to dismantle the police department in Minneapolis or implement new budgets to defund and refund community policing, that's going to be complicated policy work that needs people committed to being in positions like mayor and city councilor. And they have to be committed to listening and being able to work with each other and being able to make good policy. And it can be pretty harrowing. And I wanted people to understand, you need a thick skin, you need a big heart. I want everybody else, though, to understand, activists and citizens and journalists and political donors and anybody involved in supporting government's ability to get through the chaos and the havoc to answers. You need to support people who are committed to deliberating and actually problem solving, and you need to stand up against intimidation of any kind, because it really gets in the way of actually providing any answers in this time. And so that's the best answer that I can provide. I think you're probably right. I am hard on myself.
Look at the faces of those people who were marching around with torches. Look at them.
Yeah.
And
they're right. The right-wing white nationalist, racist extremists in this country who have been emboldened to, quote, unite the right and make America great again. There are people that are wearing MAGA caps among the militias. They need to be cracked down on, I believe, because they are connected with domestic terrorism. And a lot of the book talks about how you need a strategy and how the Trump administration really abandoned any strategy because they were part of their political coalition, white nationalists. So I think elected officials need to stand strong and resolute, and they need to do things like we did, which is sue them as militia organizations that are illegal. But the personal cost is very serious. And I talk in the book about, going to therapy to deal with the trauma of having been the sponge for so many verbal assaults and so much trauma across the board. And I think anybody, it's ironic, as public office has probably never been harder, but it's never been more important at the local level.
Give us a recap of where Charlottesville is at now. Just a quick recap. What happened to the memorials? And one of the questions you ask is whether this is going to be what the city is remembered for in 50 years, like Birmingham and the church bombing. But give us a recap of Charlottesville and what happened to the memorials, and then whether this is the city's 50-year sort of sentence.
Well, as we speak, on July 1st, this is the day that the law that was changed by the Virginia General Assembly after everything in Charlottesville led to a cascade of political effects in Virginia, including Democrats being elected statewide and retaking both houses of the General Assembly, which then in turn led to the law that had prevented us from moving the statues being changed. Very soon after the Unite the Right rally, I called on the governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe at the time, to call the General Assembly back for a special session to get rid of that law, which he didn't do. But now that law is gone, and today the law is in effect. It came into effect July 1st. So I think that the city council in Charlottesville very quickly, and the city manager, are going to move the Robert E. Lee statue, and probably the Stonewall Jackson one. I think that could happen very soon. they have been in place this whole time. So that's what's going to happen. I think that they'll be moved really soon. I don't know where they're going to go, but I think that the city is still internally traumatized, although some of the trauma has been processed through I talk in the book about the metaphor of intermeshed gears, where the least powerful small gears, the ones that move the most fast, like social media, but then the most powerful big gears, the ones that move the most slow, like prosecuting the guy who weaponized his car and killed Heather Heyer, which took over a year, but he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. And I think that when those prosecutions happen successfully, those convictions, that really did lead to a lot of healing. The city has done a lot of healing on its own. We have an African-American female mayor who I seconded the nomination of, even though we disagreed on a whole host of things. There's a whole interesting story about that in the book. And the city has really adopted an equity lens and has focused including while I was mayor and while I was still in the city council, on equity as a response to white nationalism. So I think that internally there's been a lot of progress, but it's still pretty raw 3 years on, and it's very dynamic. Kind of nationally, internationally, I think that Charlottesville is this morphing phenomenon where it's going to continue to grow in meaning, which amazes me. You have Joe Biden running his presidential campaign about Charlottesville and Trump's response to Charlottesville. You have Charlottesville becomes more and more meaningful as we see more and more transparently how central violent white nationalism is to Trumpism. The kind of first reveal of that was Charlottesville, when he said there were good people on both sides. He was really casting Confederate sympathizers as sympathetic. But now it's much worse when you see what it really meant, and you've had so many other instances. I think that who knows what history is going to say about where the Black community originally was on statues and what's happening with these statues now and where we'll be 10 years from now. I think it's important to just understand this history, because it's what Faulkner said, history is not in the past, it's not even past. We are literally creating modern history as we speak, and Charlottesville created modern history, and there's a lot of surprising tales in it. And the final thing I would say is there's a lot in the book about the First Amendment and this horrible set of ties that bind the hands between freedom of speech and public safety. And I believe that courts are going to be more pragmatic toward local officials' attempts to achieve public safety as a result of Charlottesville, as a result of how these black and white absolute tests that we had to apply. I think that First Amendment jurisprudence is changing as we speak, and there's a lot of evidence of that. And I think that Charlottesville will lead to the nation learning that we have to have a set of more pragmatic tools to deal with this kind of metastasizing violent white nationalism now that's happening, and that you can't tie public officials' hands just because they don't have like a written down statement of I plan to do this unlawful act at this time-stamped date in the future.
Right. And just for people who may not have read it yet, there was such a sort of a struggle over whether the clear and present danger had been presented just by the blanket statement of we're going to be there on such and such day, and we would maybe one day like to do these things, but we're not giving you an actual time and place that we're doing them. That was frustrating to read about in the book, but I just wanted to recap that for everybody. So you write, it's easy to be simple, but more important to be complex. So what are some tips on how to be complex without compromising your values?
What I believe is that we are dealing, if we're going to deal with systemic racism and gross inequality in this country, and racial disparities across education, opportunity, economic opportunity, environmental justice, there's part of that conversation that begins in rage and in anger and in kind of pretty simplified observations. But if we're going to move it toward what we do, and how do you actually rectify? We have dozens of programs in place in Charlottesville to deal with economic injustice, small business supports, minority contracting, and you're eating away at the problem, but localities can only, you need bigger and bolder measures, and that means that we need to talk about policy and budgets and evidence and programs that work and the federal part on this. And that's serious stuff. That's like New Deal type work. That's not tweets, and it's not politics. So it's not even signing petitions. It's like getting your hands really dirty with government. That's one answer that I have. And if we're going to seriously get a handle on violent white nationalism and domestic terrorism in this country, that means we need sweeping tools across social media platforms, across mid-level tech companies. I talk a lot about this in the book, many examples of tech companies choosing to adopt these trust and safety platforms and programs. The federal government and local and state governments need to up their intelligence needs and their prosecution of violent groups. The Trump administration took white nationalists out of basically the lens of potential domestic terrorism, and that's a lesson from Charlottesville, and people need to support this work from the professionals who do it.
And it's okay to be complex. I mean, it's really easy to sit there on Facebook and go, no, yes, no, yes, no, and you fight with all your friends and neighbors, but you have to be comfortable with yourself, and you have to be able to be complex.
The things that I'm most proud of in the book and in my time in office, and I just tell this story again, not because I'm that important, but because anybody who's looking at conflicts and havoc in government today, which is happening again all around the country, I wanted to tell some of these stories. Creating affordable housing is really complex. We quadrupled the rate of affordable housing creation in my last month as mayor as a result of 812. And it's very complicated to leverage dollars and to work with experienced developers who have real estate. And we were able to redevelop public housing in Charlottesville, in part because the Dave Matthews Band put in over $10 million in a partnership deal with the city. That's complicated. Creating alliances and finding dollars in a scarce time and actually getting equity created rather than just acts about equity is going to be complex. So you need people who believe in government and who are going to follow through and not just try and get some victory that they do a tweet about, but then there doesn't actually impact people's lives. So I think the nature of the challenges and the nature of the victories it's inherently complex, and that's why it's hard work, and that's why it's important to have good people do it. So yeah, there's a moral in the story, which is the answers to what was unrevealed in Charlottesville mean that government and good government and government that doesn't oversimplify these problems is more important than it ever has been.
All right. I want to wrap this up, Mayor, with one last quote that just struck me from the book. Heather Heyer's own mother says, we have to have pain to proceed as a society. Yeah. Now, she doesn't make any bones about not wanting to make that trade. Of course, she would never make that trade. But she does say we have to have pain to proceed. Why did you think that was so important as to include it?
Well, she's a friend of mine, Susan Bro, and she's an amazing person. And a lot of people were very surprised that we got to be friends because she had every right to be angry at everybody in the city. She understands a lot about the nature of government that we had and what I tried to do, what we tried to do. And I was sitting down with her as I was finishing the book, and I asked her about this idea that is central to the book, which is how can struggle and pain, what role can they play in progress? And I had this idea that I took from Greek tragedy, which is the agony can be an engine to progress. We don't think about it that way, but if we look at our own lives, a lot of the time the worst things that happened to you ended up opening a door to the best things that you pursued. And I just wanted to kind of test that idea with her, because that's how I see Charlottesville playing in our country's modern history. I think it's ultimately all of the pain will ultimately have a purpose. That's really the question and my contention. And she ended up not only reinforcing it, but going deep in her own personal experience and talking about what had happened with her daughter's death. And she drew a metaphor from her own, a very painful surgery that she had where they had to get this infection out from underneath the surgery. And she talks about needing to excise the rot and the infection and the wounds underneath our history. And that's painful. But the pain ultimately does get us to a place where we couldn't have gotten to but for that process. So that's the value. I was so honored that she spoke to me that candidly about what she'd been through, and it really was a capstone for that overarching kind of observation in the book.
Well, I'm sure you, like all of us, think of Heather Heyer and her family every day.
Yep.
Former Charlottesville Mayor Mike Signer, author of Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege. Thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be your second guest, I think. And it's a great thing you're doing with this podcast. Well, I think many people appreciate it. Well,
we appreciate it. Certainly check out that book. Also his book on James Madison, which is fantastic. It's called Becoming Madison. And also his Twitter feed is at Mike Signer. Thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.